The notice came on a Tuesday, in March of 1887, slipped under the door of the weaving room before dawn, when the only sound in the Aldrich house was the creak of the floorboards above and the low moan of an Iowa wind finding every gap it could. Nora Voss found it when she came downstairs to light the loom. She was 22 years old, and she had lived in that house for 6 years, ever since her mother died and her father's older brother, Edmund Aldrich, had taken her in. That was the word he used, taken her in, as though she were a stray. She picked up the folded paper. Her name was written on the outside in Edmund's careful, deliberate hand. The man had the penmanship of a courthouse clerk and the conscience of a landlord. She already knew before she broke the seal what it would say. The property at 14 Mill Road, being the sole residence and business premises of Edmund Aldrich, is required for expanded operations beginning April 1st. Miss Nora Voss is hereby given 30 days to secure alternative arrangements. A sum of $20 has been set aside as a courtesy to assist her departure. We want you to sit with that for a moment. $20. That was the price Edmund Aldrich put on 6 years of Nora's labor. 6 years of weaving cloth that was sold under his name at the Harlan County Fair and in 3 dry goods stores as far east as Davenport. 6 years of waking before the household, maintaining the loom that had belonged to her mother's teacher, carding and dyeing and threading until her fingers bled in the cold months and her eyes ached in the dim ones. $20. The price of a decent winter coat, or perhaps 2 months of rent in a city where she knew nobody and had no references that Edmund Aldrich would agree to sign. She set the paper on the workbench beside the loom. She did not crumple it. She did not cry. She folded it in half and placed it in the pocket of her apron. And then she sat down at the loom and began to work, and there were 12 yards of wool twill due at Porter's Dry Goods by Thursday, and she intended to finish what she had started. That evening, after Edmund had retired and the house had gone quiet, Nora sat at the kitchen table with a candle and a piece of paper and tried to calculate her way out of a problem that did not have a clean solution. She wrote the word assets at the top of the left column. Her own savings came to $31 and some change, tucked in a tin box beneath the floorboard of the weaving room. She had the clothes on her back, a good wool coat, and a pair of boots that were almost new. She had her mother's Bible, and, more importantly, she had the tool chest that had belonged to Margaret Finch. Margaret Finch. We should tell you about Margaret Finch, because without her, none of what comes next would have been possible. Margaret had been the finest textile artist in Harlan County for 30 years before her hands gave out. She was 64 when Nora was 16, and for 2 years before the arthritis made her fingers useless. Margaret had taken Nora on as an apprentice every afternoon after Nora finished her chores at Edmund's house. She had not charged for the lessons. She had said only that she expected to be repaid in kind someday, when Nora found a girl who needed teaching as much as Nora had. Margaret Finch had died in the winter of 1885 with no children and no surviving family, and she had left Nora the one thing that mattered. Not money, not property. Her full tool chest, 17 specialized implements that a master weaver accumulated over a lifetime. The English-made warping board with its brass fittings, the temple hooks, the boat shuttles of hand-carved applewood, the threading hook with the ivory handle, and above all, the rigid heddle loom, small and portable and worth, to someone who knew what they were looking at, considerably more than Edmund Aldrich's $20 courtesy. These were the assets. On the right side of the page, Nora wrote liabilities. The first entry was her age, 22. A single woman, unattached, with no formal training certificate, no guild membership, no letter of reference from an employer who wasn't currently trying to put her out of his house. Below that she wrote geography. Harlan County, Iowa, in March of 1887 was not a place that offered many paths for a young woman without family. The nearest city of any size was Council Bluffs, 40 miles west. She knew no one there. The journey alone would cost $6 or $7. A room in a boarding house would run $3 a week at least, and that assumed the landlady would take a single woman without a reference. She could stay in Harlan, of course. But Harlan was Edmund's territory, and Edmund was a man with a long memory and a longer reach. He sat on the county trade committee. He had been instrumental in organizing the annual fair at which most of the local merchants sold their goods. If he did not want Nora to find work in Harlan, she would not find work in Harlan. She had seen him operate. She knew what that looked like. The arithmetic was merciless. Her $51 would last, by her most careful calculation, about 4 months in a city where nobody knew her, and another woman behind every door was looking for the same seamstress work. By July, she would be in serious difficulty. By September, destitute. She looked at the columns for a long time. Outside, the Iowa wind was hammering at the shutters, and somewhere in the dark a gate was banging on its hinge. She blew out the candle to save oil and sat in the dark. She was not afraid. Or rather, the fear was there. She could feel it, cold and small at the base of her throat. But it was not the kind that unmade you. It was the kind that sharpened things. Her hand found the edge of the tool chest, sitting on the floor beside her chair. The wood was worn smooth along the top, where Margaret's hands had rested for decades. Nora ran her thumb along the brass latch. "You have a skill that most people don't," Margaret had told her once, in that direct, undecorated way she had of speaking. "Most people can make cloth. You can read cloth. That's a different thing entirely. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't worth something." Nora sat up a little straighter, in the dark. Reading cloth. That was what Margaret had called it. The ability to look at a piece of woven fabric, any piece, from a feed sack to a bolt of imported French wool, and identify its construction. The fiber content, the thread count, the dye process, the loom type. The region it had likely come from, the faults, if there were any, and how they had come to be. It was a skill that took years to develop and was rarer than people supposed. Margaret had possessed it at a level that had made her a quiet legend among the textile merchants of the region. She had passed it to Nora with the same patient, deliberate attention she gave to everything. The world had offered Nora a set of choices that didn't fit. She would have to make her own. She thought about what she had. $51, the tool chest, the skill, and one more thing, a name. Not her own, Margaret's. Margaret Finch had sold cloth and consulting work to buyers as far away as St. Louis and Chicago. Her correspondence, bundled in ribbon and stored at the bottom of the tool chest, represented years of professional relationships with people who would recognize that name and know what it meant. Nora had never been to St. Louis or Chicago. She had barely been to Council Bluffs. But she was, she decided, about to find out what Margaret's name was worth beyond the county line. She spent the next 3 days preparing with the same methodical attention she gave to her weaving. She wrote letters, 6 of them, to the buyers whose names appeared most frequently in Margaret's correspondence. She introduced herself as Margaret Finch's apprentice and executor of her professional estate, explained that she had inherited the full tool chest and intended to continue Margaret's consulting work, and asked whether any current needs for assessment or restoration work might be outstanding. She used Margaret's letterhead, which she had found in the correspondence bundle. She signed her own name, but she placed Margaret Finch's name in the top right corner of the page, as a credential, as a flag, as a door left open by a dead woman's reputation. She also packed. It was a precise, unsentimental process. Everything she would take fit into 2 canvas bags and the tool chest. The rest she left. She did not take the rocking chair by the stove that she had sat in every evening for 6 years. She did not take the small quilt she had made her second winter there, which still hung on the wall of the weaving room. Those things belonged to the life that was ending. She took what she needed, and she left before Edmund came down to breakfast. The stage to Council Bluffs cost $6. Nora sat with the tool chest braced between her feet and watched the Iowa landscape roll past the window, the flat brown fields just beginning to show the first pale suggestions of spring. She did not look back at Harlan. There was nothing there she needed to see. Council Bluffs was bigger and louder and colder than she had expected. The wind off the Missouri River cut through her coat, in a way the prairie wind in Harlan never quite had. She found a boarding house on Willow Street, run by a woman named Frances Dodd, who charged $2.50 a week, meals included, and who asked no questions about where Nora had come from, which suited Nora perfectly. Her room was small, a bed, a dresser, a single window overlooking the alley, but it was hers. She set the tool chest at the foot of the bed and sat down and listened to the sounds of the city pressing in around her, and tried to remember that she had chosen this. The first response to her letters arrived 11 days later. It came from a man named Gerald Harmon, who ran a textile importing business in St. Louis under the name Harmon and Sons. Margaret Finch had done consulting work for him twice, he said, assessing a shipment of English broadcloth that had been misrepresented by the supplier. He had always intended to engage her again and was sorry to hear of her passing. He had heard great things of her apprentice. As it happened, he did have a situation that required the kind of expertise Margaret had provided. Would Miss Voss be available to travel to St. Louis? Nora read the letter twice, very carefully. Then she sat for a long time, looking out the window at the alley. St. Louis. She had $43 left. A train ticket to St. Louis would cost most of what remained for the journey. If Gerald Harmon did not engage her, or if the work proved unsatisfactory, she would be stranded in a city far larger and less forgiving than Council Bluffs, with almost nothing. She wrote back the same afternoon. Yes, she said. She was available. We will tell you that when Nora Voss stepped off the train at Union Station in St. Louis on the morning of April 14, 1887, with her 2 canvas bags and her dead teacher's tool chest, she looked younger than 22 and considerably more uncertain than she intended to appear. The station was enormous. The noise was enormous. Everything was enormous, in a way that Harlan County had never prepared her for. She found Gerald Harmon's offices on Chestnut Street. He was a compact, energetic man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the fast, darting attention of someone whose business depended on catching things that other people missed. He met her in the front room, shook her hand with brisk efficiency, and led her back through the warehouse to where the problem was waiting. The problem was 47 bolts of wool suiting fabric, supposedly imported from a mill in Yorkshire, purchased at premium price for a contract supplying uniforms to a regional railroad company. The contract was due to be fulfilled in 6 weeks. 3 days ago, one of Harmon's floor workers had noticed that several bolts seemed lighter than the others. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Harmon had his doubts. The supplier insisted the fabric was genuine Yorkshire mill production. The railroad company's purchasing agent was growing impatient, and if the fabric turned out to be something other than what he'd paid for. Gerald Harmon was looking at a contract breach, a supplier dispute, and a reputation problem that could cost him far more than the original purchase. He needed someone who could look at the cloth and tell him the truth. Nora set the tool chest on the work table, opened it, and went to work. She was in there for 4 hours. She did not rush. She examined every bolt, working in the order Margaret had taught her, touching first, holding the fabric up to the light, then using the loop to examine the weave structure. She noted the thread count, the spin direction of the warp, and weft, the finishing technique. She pulled samples of fiber from 3 different bolts and examined them under the lens with a care that she could see was making Gerald Harmon nervous from where he stood by the door. She already knew by the second bolt, but she took her time, because the kind of claim she was about to make needed to be unassailable. When she was done, she closed the tool chest and turned to face him. 28 of the 47 bolts, she told him, were genuine Yorkshire production. She could identify the mill. It was almost certainly Ackroyd's in Bradford, based on the selvage treatment and the twist rate. The remaining 19 were domestic production, likely from a Pennsylvania mill, woven on a power loom with a slightly different heddle configuration. The fiber content was similar but not identical, with a higher cotton blend in the domestic cloth. The weight discrepancy his worker had noticed was real. The fabric would perform adequately for most purposes, but it would not wear the same way as the genuine article, and it would not hold its shape under the kind of sustained daily wear that uniform fabric required. She put it in plain language. He had been sold a mixed shipment, with the genuine bolts used to camouflage the substitution, and whoever had done it carefully enough that it would have gotten past most buyers. It had not gotten past Margaret Finch's student. Gerald Harmon was quiet for a moment. Then he asked how soon she could produce a written report, signed and dated, that could be used as documentation in a dispute with the supplier. She told him she could have it by morning. He offered her $25 for the assessment and the report. She told him her fee was $35. He looked at her for a moment over the top of his spectacles. Then he said, "Fair enough," and went to his desk to write the check. That night, in a boarding house room on Locust Street that cost considerably more than the one in Council Bluffs, but was considerably closer to what she needed to be, Nora Voss sat at the small writing desk and composed her report by lamplight. She was precise and thorough, and used the language Margaret had taught her, the technical vocabulary of someone who had spent decades in the trade. It was good work. She knew it was good work. She had the peculiar clarity that comes after doing something difficult well, a kind of quiet after the storm of effort. She thought about Edmund Aldrich and his $20 courtesy, and she felt nothing in particular. Not satisfaction, not anger. Just the clean fact of the distance between what he had thought she was worth and what she had just demonstrated herself to be. The second letter, which arrived at Harmon's office the following week addressed to her care, came from a woman named Helen Pruitt, who ran a textile wholesale business in Chicago and had been a longtime client of Margaret Finch's. She had heard from Gerald Harmon, she said. She had a standing situation that required exactly the kind of expertise Nora had apparently demonstrated. Would Miss Voss consider a retainer arrangement? A retainer. Nora read that word several times. She wrote back and asked what terms Mrs. Pruitt had in mind. What Helen Pruitt had in mind was a 6-month arrangement, renewable at $40 a month, in exchange for Nora being available to assess incoming shipments on a 2-day turnaround basis. She would need to be in Chicago, or close enough to get there quickly. Travel expenses for assessments outside the city would be reimbursed separately. $40 a month. Nora sat with that number for a long while. It was more than she had imagined making. It was more than Edmund made. In a month from the cloth she had woven for him, she was almost certain. She wrote back and accepted. She arrived in Chicago on a Wednesday in May, with her 2 canvas bags and the tool chest. The city was a different scale of everything. The noise, the traffic, the lake, the sheer vertical weight of the buildings. She found a room in a boarding house on Indiana Avenue. The 3rd she had rented in as many months, and she stood at the window and looked out at the city and let herself feel, briefly, the thing that had been waiting underneath, the practicality. Since the morning she had found Edmund's note on the floor. She had been cast out of the only home she had known for 6 years with $20 in 30 days. She had taken what Margaret Finch gave her, the tools, the knowledge, the professional name, and she had walked herself, one careful, deliberate step at a time, to here. The tool chest was on the desk beside her. She rested her hand on the worn lid. She thought about the ivory threading hook with its carved handle, the one Margaret had saved for the finest work. Margaret had pressed it into Nora's hands on the last afternoon they had worked together. 2 weeks before the arthritis made it impossible. "This one knows what it's doing," she had said. "You'll know when to use it." Nora had used it on Gerald Harmon's broadcloth, feeling through the weave for what didn't belong. She had used it on 3 other assessments since. It never failed to find the thing that others missed. She had not been given money, or a name, or a piece of land. She had been given a way of seeing, and that, it turned out, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing that mattered. Helen Pruitt was a brisk, direct woman in her late 40s who met Nora at her warehouse on Michigan Avenue and shook her hand with the unceasing energy of someone who did not believe in wasting the first 5 minutes of a professional relationship on pleasantries. She showed Nora the operation, 4 rooms of incoming textile inventory, most of it imported, all of it requiring documentation of quality before it moved further into the supply chain. The problem she faced was the same one Gerald Harmon had faced. The market had grown complicated, the suppliers less reliable, and the consequences of a misrepresented shipment had grown correspondingly expensive. She needed someone who could not be fooled. Nora looked at the inventory, and then looked at Helen Pruitt, and said she thought she could be useful. Over the following weeks, she demonstrated exactly how useful. She found 2 more instances of fraudulent blending in incoming shipments within her first month, saving Helen Pruitt's business a combined loss of several $100s. Word traveled, as it does in professional circles, with the quiet speed of mutual interest. By June, Nora had 2 other clients in Chicago asking for her availability. By July, she had turned down one potential engagement because she did not have the hours for it. She was not wealthy, not yet, but she was solvent and then some, and she was building something, careful yard by careful yard, in exactly the way Margaret Finch had taught her to build cloth, thread by thread, and never faster than the material could bear. The reckoning with Edmund Aldrich came in August, not because Nora sought it out, but because the textile trade was a smaller world than it appeared. Edmund had expanded as he always intended to. He was producing more cloth, selling under an expanded arrangement with a new regional distributor, a man named Claude Bayer who operated out of Des Moines and supplied dry goods stores across 4 counties. The arrangement had been profitable for a season. Then the complaints had started arriving, fabric shrinking unexpectedly, dye lots inconsistent, thread counts that did not match the label. Claude Bayer, a careful businessman, hired an independent assessor to examine a sample of the disputed cloth before deciding whether to continue the arrangement with Edmund or seek damages for breach of contract. The assessor he hired was Helen Pruitt's recommendation. He hired Nora Voss. We want you to imagine what it was like when she opened the shipping crate that arrived at Helen Pruitt's warehouse on a Tuesday in August and saw the selge marks she recognized. The Aldrich household had used the same threading pattern for the border work for as long as she had run that loom. She had designed that pattern herself in her 2nd year at Edmund's house, and he had used it ever since because it was distinctive and appealing and brought the cloth an air of quality it did not always otherwise possess. She recognized it in approximately 4 seconds. She took out the ivory threading hook and began her examination. The cloth was what she expected it to be. Edmund had cut costs somewhere in his expansion. The fiber blend was not what the label stated. The dye was cheaper than the previous seasons. The thread count was within range on the upper bolts of each pack and noticeably lighter on the lower ones. A deliberate arrangement, designed so that a quick inspection of the exposed bolt faces would suggest consistency the whole would not deliver. She wrote her report with the same precision she brought to every assessment. She did not mention that she knew Edmund Aldrich. She did not mention that she had spent 6 years in his house. She stated only what the evidence showed, in the exact technical language the situation required, signed and dated at the bottom in her clear, steady hand. Claude Bayer received the report and terminated his arrangement with Edmund Aldrich within the week. The breach of contract claim that followed was a matter for lawyers, not for Nora, but she heard about it through the quiet network of the trade the way she heard about most things now. Indirectly, at a remove, as information rather than drama. Edmund's name came up once more, some months later, in a conversation she had with a fellow assessor at a trade meeting in Cincinnati. The word in the regional dry goods network, he said, was that a distributor out of Iowa had recently had an expensive falling out with a local weaver over misrepresented quality, and the man's business had not recovered its former standing. It was, her colleague observed, the kind of situation that was always preventable and rarely recovered from. Nora said that she was sorry to hear it and meant neither the sorry nor the hearing it, and moved the conversation on to other things. By the winter of 1888, she had a letterhead of her own. It read simply Nora Voss, Textile Assessment and Consultation, Chicago, Illinois. She had a client list of 11 businesses. She had a room of her own in a building on Prairie Avenue, where she could set up the tool chest properly. The implements arranged in the order Margaret had taught her, the warping board against the east wall where the morning light caught it best. She still used the ivory threading hook for the finest work. She kept it wrapped in a piece of clean muslin in the top tray of the chest, the way Margaret had always kept it. On a cold afternoon in December, a new letter arrived. It was from a young woman in Harlan County, Iowa, who had heard Nora's name from Silas Porter at the dry goods store. She had a skill she had taught herself from watching. She wrote, and she did not know what to do with it, and she did not know who else to ask. Nora read the letter twice. Then she sat for a moment at her desk, the tool chest at her elbow, the afternoon light going blue and cold outside the window. She thought of Margaret Finch sitting across from a 16-year-old girl who had nothing but attention and need, and choosing to give her 2 years of afternoons. She picked up her pen and began to write back. She told the girl to come to Chicago. She told her to bring whatever tools she had, even if they weren't much. She told her there was room enough to learn, and that learning was, in the end, the only inheritance that no one could take from you. Not a company, not a family member, not a landlord with a legal notice and a $20 courtesy, not any force on earth that thought it knew what you were worth before you'd had the chance to find out yourself. She sealed the letter and set it aside to be posted in the morning. Outside, the Chicago wind was doing what Chicago wind does in December, announcing itself against every surface with the particular directness of a place that does not believe in softening things. Nora lit another lamp and opened the ledger where she kept her accounts, the precise columns of a life being built, carefully, from the only materials she'd ever had. The tool chest sat open beside her, the implements arranged exactly as they should be, each one worn smooth in the places where capable hands had held it longest. She had not been saved. She had simply refused, at every turn, to accept the valuation that other people placed on what she carried. And here is the question we want to leave you with tonight. If someone handed you an inheritance that looked like nothing, a box of old tools, a name no one outside your county had heard of, a skill that the people around you couldn't be bothered to recognize, would you know what you were holding? Nora Voss did, and that made all the difference.